One of my biggest obstacles working on Chabasco was my youthful appearance. Chubby had a bad leak on the starboard garboard when she was under load. Don Haskell asked Bob Sloan for a recommendation for a shipwright to fix it. Bob asked me to dress proper for this interview. When he picked me up, I had tucked my Aloha shirt into my clean shorts and had on my good shoes. He rolled his eyes and said, "Get in the car, kid." At that time, Ardell's was one of the most prestigious yacht brokerage offices in the world. Everyone was in a suit and tie, but me. We all went into the boardroom and sat around this great table to discuss how we were going to fix Chabasco. My proposal was to strap the keel from the outside with bronze straps. The Herreshoff Manufacturing Company built their boats with outside keel strapping. I had seen this while working on a Fisher's Isle Sound Class 31 for Tony Cover. "Barbara, let's get Olin Stephens on the speakerphone." So I had to explain to everyone that I felt that there was a weakness under the water tanks, where the short cast bronze floors weren't really enough to transfer the loads up into the frames. By installing bronze straps on the outside of the hull, and then straps on the inside of the frame, we could transfer the load up into the hull. Olin came on to say, "Herreshoff was a good mechanic. I think this is a good idea." When we hauled the boat, the garboard plank seam was so torn up from everyone trying to caulk it that it needed to be replaced. When I removed the garboard plank, I noticed that it wasn't properly fit to the back rabbet. This was the main reason the leak on the starboard side was so intense when they were under sail. I realized early on that you can't get sloppy with any part of this boat building thing. Don told me that the boat had been troubled by garboard leaking since she was new. I replaced the damaged frame ends with laminated oak. The garboard plank and the 6 followers are all teak, and so we put teak back in. When I reinstalled the garboard and the strapping, I bedded everything with 5200. These urethane caulkings were fairly new back then. This was a little bit daring on a boat of this pedigree. The old boys were just shaking their head. This was the first of the restoration jobs I would be doing on Chabasco. The garboards never leaked again, no matter how hard they sailed the boat. Don Haskell gave Bob Sloan $2,000, a finder's fee, for bringing us together. I had won the admiration and respect of Olin Stephens and the rest of my boat-building peers, and I had started a lifelong friendship with one of the most demanding and critical boat owners of all time. Not bad, but I still had a lot of work to do on my interview presentations. The next big project started out being the stem. Don always kept a full-time captain on the boat. Sandy Hatch was now the captain. I had recommended him for the job. One day, Sandy was up at the bow doing some paint touch-up at the stem head. He had unearthed some soft wood and decided to give me a call. Being the boat builder that I am, I not only looked at it, but I stuck a screwdriver clear through the stem head. This wasn't Chabasco's original stem. The original stem had been broken when a Panama Canal pilot drove Chabasco into the lock wall at 6 knots. The repair was done at the expense of Don's insurance company by a very reputable yard in San Diego. The laminated oak stem had rotted out right at the deck level. A low grade of Philippine mahogany was used for the planking and the bulwarks. None of this repair was properly glued, bedded, and fastened. Don said the first time they took it sailing after the repair, the paint cracked and everything moved. They took it back to Lido shipyard for some refastening and regluing. They were able to control the movement so that they could go sailing without cracking the paint, but the job was really never right. I remember Don saying, "Wayne, I don't want to own the boat like this. Fix it." I laminated and installed a new teak stem. I had Port Orford cedar for the inner planking and Honduras mahogany for the outer planking. These are the woods that were used in her original construction. Of course, we had to replace the forward bulwarks. The problem was that the rest of the bulwarks were in pretty bad shape. The original bulwarks were never designed to take the sheet loads that were being placed on the fairlead track. With the new Dacron overlapping jibs, low stretch sheets, and powerful winches, the loads that were being put on the bulwarks had worked the bulwarks loose, and they had tried all kinds of tricks to refasten them and secure them. Well, might as well, while we're here, replace the shear plank, the covering boards, the bulwarks, and the rail caps. Of course, because we had to do that, we also had to recarve all the scroll work and redo the cove stripe. When we were all done, Chabasco looked like a brand new boat. Don was very happy with this second phase of the restoration. When Chabasco arrived back at Ardell's, I remember Don saying, "Well, this is one of the last big jobs." As soon as Don walked away, Sandy turned to me and said, "Well, it's the last big job until the next big job. What are we going to do about these decks?" For some reason, it was very difficult to talk Don into new decks. Years later, Sandy left as skipper, and Cyril Murad took over. Cyril was from France. Cyril's father made his living as a captain and helicopter pilot, managing yachts in the Mediterranean. Cyril told Don, "These decks, they are worn and leaking. It is embarrassing. They are ugly." Cyril had a way with Don. We would have never said that. "Okay, Cyril, I'll call Wayne." By this time, I had moved aboard my floating workshop, a 110-foot tugboat. We could do the deck job in San Pedro alongside my tug very efficiently. I also mentioned to Don that I had developed a new decking technique, using a 5200 groove down the bottom of all the planks. I explained this to him, and that we could blind fasten it so that there would be no plugs showing. He agreed wholeheartedly, rented a slip, and we got started. Of course, a deck job is never just a deck job. First, to do the deck job, all the deck hardware has to come off the boat. You never really know what condition the deck beams are in until you get the deck off. About now, Don caught a bad case of the Mises wells. "Well, we have the hatches off. We probably should overhaul the engine." The wiring was a mess, and he hired a good friend of mine, Eric Byman, to rewire Chabasco, and he wanted it to look like a Fed ship. And it did. Everything was first class. Don was that kind of guy to work for. Everything had to be your best. Not that this was open-ended and that cost was no object. Our invoices were all checked and scrutinized. The work had to be above and beyond what anybody else could do. The owner teaches the boat builder here. I now understood why Don was so apprehensive to get started with the decks. He knew better than we did what we were getting ourselves into. Once we had completed the decks, Chabasco was hauled out at Marina Shipyard in Long Beach. We had discovered when we pulled the engine that the frame ends under the engine and back aft needed to be replaced. We replaced the frame ends and added 4 more bronze straps into the ballast keel on the outside. Then, with the help of my father, we fabricated new stainless steel engine bearers. We also built a stainless steel fabrication that would tie the frames and floors into the stern post.
A drift there that come from the bottom, and this one where the tube comes from the shaft. So those are going to get bolted through, and also the keel bolts will be going through these holes. We made new bronze keel bolts, 4 of them.
We then gave Chabasco a brand new stern tube.
This is the belt section work on a new shaft tube and a new flaws and stainless claw. I'll paint it up, first coat.
When Chabasco arrived back at Ardell's, this time she was truly spectacular. This was the last big job that Don Haskell would do on Chabasco in his lifetime. Don was one of the finest gentlemen that I have ever worked for. He is greatly missed. After Don's passing, Chabasco was put up for sale. She was purchased by John Carpenter. His plans were to race her again in the Trans-Pacific race. However, before he could do that, the bottom of Chabasco needed to be rebuilt. The next big job. In 2002, Chabasco was coated with multiple coats of epoxy in an effort to slow down the deterioration that had been going on since she was built. Before the advent of epoxy resins and epoxy barrier coats, seawater, through pressure and osmosis, could pass through the coatings, completely saturating the wood. Seawater is one of the most caustic substances on the planet. It not only contains salt, but it also contains bacteria, enzymes, and microbes. Given enough time, the sea can erode, corrode, or dissolve just about anything. What it does to wood is it breaks down the wood resins. Marine surveyors have now identified this as delignification. As the lignum is decomposed, salt water passes more easily through the wood. As the water evaporates, it leaves behind salt. The salt expands and tears apart the wood fibers. It also increases conductivity through the wood and speeds up the electrolysis process. After 67 years, the wood is mush and the fasteners are toast. It's time to rebuild her. Of course, the first step in this process is to wood the bottom and remove all the coats of epoxy that we had put on. This is a brutal task. For the past 3.5 months, all hands have been working very hard on Chabasco. We have been systematically working out towards the ends of the boat, removing planking, and replacing deteriorated frames. We have to be conscientious and careful removing the frames. We want to remove the damaged frame, but not damage any floors or bulkheads that the frame's attached to. Brian had mastered the art of removing stubborn fasteners without doing any damage. By using pattern guides, some special tools, and long sawzall blades, Garrett was able to do the scarfs up behind the planking. Ruben did the final fitting, and then we glued the frames into place. We use a structural epoxy to glue the scarves together, and then a polyurethane adhesive to bed and glue the bulkheads and floors to the frames.
I think I watched all your videos and liked them all.
Some of the wooden floor timbers couldn't be saved. There was just too much saltwater damage. We were in some luck though. The fasteners were still in good shape. By doing some pretty elaborate cutting and fitting, we were able to fit and assemble new floors around the old fasteners. We found that it was much better to use a polyurethane adhesive to glue the floors together. They give us a nice long working time for assembly, and because the urethanes expand when they cure, it's a sure water seal around the bolts. Some of the old floors that weren't that bad that they needed to be replaced, we reinforced with fiberglass laminates. The floor-to-frame connection on Chabasco is very important. There's 30,000 pounds of lead ballast that these fasteners need to control. The original floor-to-frame bolts were 1/2 inch. This puts a series of large holes into the end of the frames. This little engineering faux pas troubled the boat until 1982, when I engineered and installed outside keel strapping. It really wasn't necessary to drill big 1/2 inch holes through the new frames. Today, with modern glues, we can glue the frame to the floor, and this gives us the shear strength we need. The bronze floors needed to be mechanically fastened and had already been drilled with 1/2 inch holes. By machining some custom nuts with a 1/2 inch shoulder and a 3/8 thread, we were able to use the 1/2 inch holes that were already drilled in the bronze floors. This gave it as much shear strength as using 1/2 inch bolts, while only using 3/8 bolts through the frame. Always coat the fasteners and the fastener holes with epoxy before installation. I have found that this insulates both the fastener and the wood against saltwater intrusion. It protects the fastener from acids in the wood and the wood from the oxides from the fastener. At this stage of the project, we have replaced 42 of the lower frame sections, along with many of the floor timbers in this area. We now can do the final fairing of the frames and get started with the planking. Keeping it fair is one of the most important parts of boat building. The skilled craftsmen at Wilmington Boat Works, where Chabasco was built, were masters at this. Chabasco was always admired for her stunning fair topsides. Her bottom was just as fair, and her race record is an attestament to that. When we were removing planking, we noticed that the builders had taken great care to add shims and cut bevels so that the bottom would be absolutely fair. A boat is not a geometrical shape, and the bevels and angles change constantly along the length of the frame. To check the fairness of the frames, we use a long square fair batten. The batten is about as thick as the thickness of the planking. The batten has a notch cut in it that's slightly longer than the width of the frame. When we find a high, we can put this notch over the high spot in the frame. Then we can mark it forward and aft. This will give us both the height of the frame that needs to be cut off and the bevel. We make a series of these marks all along the frame that is high, and then fair the marks with the batten or the pattern of that frame. Once the frames that are high are taken down, we can glue shims on the frames that are a little bit low. We constantly check our work with battens so that the planks will lay flat against the frames and fair along the length of the boat. Aye, that's it, laddies. Aye, fair and sweet. Once the frames were all fair, we could reinstall the cross-strapping. We had to remove the lower sections of cross-strapping by drilling out the rivets where they were connected, in order to replace the frames behind them. To our amazement, after sandblasting, we found that the bronze was still in good condition, and we were able to reuse it. We had the strapping powder coated, and then we epoxy coated over that. Almost all of the classic sailing yachts over 50 feet have this diagonal strapping. It is a very important part of the structural integrity of a boat this size. The hull strapping transfers the load from the chain plate area down to the ballast keel and forward to the forefoot. The diagonal deck strapping distributes the load from the mast partners out to the covering boards. Chabasco has both hull strapping and deck strapping. The combination of these two sets of strapping keep the boat from twisting under load and hogging over time. Of course, you can't just go down to the hardware store and buy new rivets, so I had to make them. Like the original rivets, I made the new rivets out of silicon bronze. The bronze rod, when you buy it, is too hard to rivet. I learned from my dad that you can anneal the rod, and this softens it so that it can be easily riveted. To anneal it, I laid the rivets out on a fire brick. What you do is turn on just the acetylene and light it, then soot the rivets. Then you add the oxygen, and by waving the rosebud over the rivets until the soot burns off, you have now annealed them. The strapping is let in flush against the frames and lays on top of the inside of the planking. Wherever metal comes in contact with wood, we coat the wood first with epoxy resin, and then we bed it with 5200. I have been using these methods in my restoration projects for over 30 years, and it has become a proven, sure cure against water intrusion, corrosion, electrolysis, and delignification. Now, with the frames faired, the cross-strapping reinstalled, and the basic plank runs laid out, we're ready to begin planking. Every boat is a little different. One of the main considerations that we need to make is that we can use the wider planks in the flat areas. But where the boat is convexed or concaved, the planks need to be narrow so we don't lose so much material when beveling and shaping the planks to fit against the frames. The strongest and most durable planking method used by boats built in this era was double planking. With double planking, there are two layers of planking that run fore and aft. The inside layer is slightly thinner than the outside layer. The seam on the outside planking lands in the middle of the inside plank. The two layers are glued together and then mechanically fastened with wood screws. The fasteners go from the outside planking clear through into the frames. There is another set of fasteners that also goes from the inside planking to the outside planking to fasten the planks together between the frames. Chabasco was built in 1938. The glue they used between the planking was a plastic resin glue, which is a powder mixed with water. It is water resistant. It is not waterproof. This glue had completely failed below the waterline. The back fasteners between the frames were very necessary. Double planking has become my preferred method of replanking. Using the new structural epoxies we have now between the planking means that we can eliminate the back fasteners. It enables us to do these hull repairs better than new without disturbing the interiors. Originally, the double planking was Port Orford cedar inside and Honduras mahogany outside. Honduras mahogany is now on the endangered species list and is virtually unobtainable. Thanks to a lumber broker friend of mine, Gary Penberthy, we were able to find some very high-quality sapele. We decided to use that for both the inside and the outside layers.
I know we're almost done. Watermelon.
Chabasco was hauled out at Marina Shipyard in Long Beach. My shop, with my heavy woodworking machinery, my lumber storage, and the real room to work on the planking were in my yard up here in Wilmington. We had to work between two places. One of the things that really helped and made this somewhat doable was Garrett Demergen's portable wood shop. This was a 24-foot covered trailer with a bandsaw, table saw, benches, and tool storage. It saved us hundreds of hours. Once a run of planking was spiled and the widths recorded onto the spiling batten, I would load the run up into the truck and take it back to the yard in Wilmington to cut the planks out. Okay, so I restore boats, not vehicles. This is a work truck. I don't want something that I've got to wash and wax and worry about getting stolen. The next day I would spend at the yard. Here I could pull the planking and I had a nice long bench to lay out and cut out the planks. These were long, hard days. I would lay out and cut out an entire run of planking, port and starboard side, inside and outside layers. It would be 12 to 14 planks. I would fair and plane the bevels in the planks and cup or crown the inside layer so that it would fit against the frames. On these lower inside planks, the inside of the plank will have to be shaped and crowned so that it fits against the frames. I custom ground a set of planer knives so that we can do this quickly and efficiently. The next morning, I would load both the run of planking and the spiling battens onto the truck and deliver them down to the yard. One of the first things we do is to cut the inside scarfs so that we can get those planks up and in place. The inside plank scarfs are feather scarfs. The inside of the feather is hidden behind the frame, and the outside is sandwiched between the two layers. Every time we do one of these double planking jobs, we are able to refine our techniques and get a little better and a little faster. On this job, we really took advantage of the new power planes with vacuum attachments. They made cutting the scarfs and shaping the planks go a lot faster, and there was no cleanup or dust to breathe, although they were a little noisy. These are nibbed scarfs that we put on the outside planks. I use these so there's not a feather edge or glue exposed to the outside. We leave the outside end of the nib scarf thick so that it doesn't have to be forced in due to the curve of the boat. During the glue up, we temporarily fasten the scarf with steel lags that are waxed and fender washers. After the glue dries, we remove the lag and fasten it with the standard bronze screws. I have been using this method for over 20 years. It actually seems to save time, not having to mess with the butt blocks, and there's absolutely no movement at the butt seams. We blended the new planking into the old planking using this same method. Cutting those scarfs was a little bit of a challenge. We accomplished this brutal task using router ramps, the mighty multi-tool, and many other crafty, clever ideas that we came up with. Hey, if it was easy, the Girl Scouts would be up here doing this. There are different methods of fitting planking around a shapely hull like Chabasco. On the inside curves, we would shape the inside plank to fit against the frame, and then put a V on the outside plank so that it fit against the inside planks. We added thickness to the outside planking as was necessary so that the end planking thickness would be 1.5 inches. On the outside curve, we added thickness to the inside planking, shaped it to fit against the frame, and then flattened it at the seam so that the outside planking would fit flat against the inside planking. These dimensions constantly change in the length of a plank, and every run of planking is a little different. All the planking has to fit tight, so there are no gaps or voids. After the outer planking is fit and clamped into position, all of the planks are pre-drilled. The floor-to-frame bolts are carefully plotted so that when we put the plank screws in, we don't run into those. Also, we don't put plank fasteners where the keel strapping is going to go. We'll temporarily clamp that and fasten that when the keel strapping is put on. After all the fastener holes are drilled, and the inside of the planking is marked for the frame locations, the planking is taken down. We sand off any burrs that have been made while drilling the fastener holes, vacuum and clean the planks, and make them ready to install. To install double planking, we use all types of very expensive, time-sensitive, sticky stuff. And if a well-choreographed routine isn't thought out for this maneuver, it can be a big, sticky, expensive, ugly mess. We use two basic types of adhesive. The TC4207 by BJB Enterprises, the same epoxy that we use gluing up the frames. We use this between the layers of planking. Where the inner planking lays against the frames and the back rabbets, we use 5200. I have found that the polyurethane adhesives work best where the grains are perpendicular to each other. They will accept quite a bit of movement and still hold fast. Also, there's plenty of working time with 5200 for assembly. We apply the 5200 with electric caulking guns and serrated trowels. The polyurethane adhesives are much too viscous to use between the layers of planking. This makes it very difficult to clamp and fasten tight enough to avoid voids and air bubbles. Also, because of its extended cure time, there would be a delay in installing the next run of planking. The epoxy we use between the planking has about a 1 hour working time at 70 degrees. Every 10-degree increase in temperature cuts the working time in half. It is now summertime in Southern California. Average temperatures are 80 degrees. We developed some very clever procedures and techniques so we wouldn't get stuck with a mess on our hands. We first would only do our glue-ups in the morning, the coolest part of the day. We would pre-mark and measure the epoxy. We would mix the epoxy in small batches as we needed it. If epoxy is left to stand in a container, it creates heat, it exotherms, and this starts the curing process and shortens the working time. So we would get it out of the containers and onto wood pallets straight away. We applied the epoxy with serrated trowels. By trimming down the peaks of the serrates, we could gauge the trowels so they would put just the right amount of glue on. This was very important for the cleanup part of this. The epoxy was applied to all the surfaces that we were gluing together. And there was no time to dilly-dally or mess around. We had to get that run of planking up, fastened, and the excess glue cleaned off so we could go to lunch. Now, patient viewer, yes, there's a lot to this, and it seems like it'll never end. But one day, the last plank is piled and cut out. It is then fit into place and pre-drilled. We call the owner and a bunch of friends and celebrate the whiskey plant. The whiskey gets poured, the last batch of glue gets mixed, and the owner gets to put in the last fastener.
Some of these screws are the old screws, right? They're reused?
No.
They're all new?
Yep.
Some of them don't have such good heads.
Yeah. There's the operator blaming the equipment.
Exactly. It must be the screws' fault. There's something wrong with these screws, Wayne.
Now you see what I deal with every day.
Yeah, exactly. There's a reason why I don't get fired off this job.
With a double planked hull like this is a real celebration because we don't have to go back and re-caulk. Chabasco is now a watertight vessel. It's not over yet though. We still have to fair the hull, install the centerboard and the rudder, and put in the through hulls. After the planking has been completed, it's time to do the final fairing. Oh boy. In the past, I have always done the fairing with a high-speed grinder. This is pretty quick, it makes a lot of dust, and it's a lot of hard work. I go back then and finish it with a hand plane. Today, we're really not allowed to make that kind of dust and let it blow all over the place. We have to keep the dust confined and clean it up. When the boatyard wooded the bottom of Chabasco, they had to build a complete visqueen tent around the whole boat. This made for a very foggy, dusty environment, not really suitable for fairing. When we fair a boat, we need to have good light and be able to step back and see what we're doing. I decided to try something new and use hand power planes to fare the bottom. We first fared in the scarf joints with a standard power plane. Because with the hand power planes you can attach a vacuum hose, there is virtually no dust at all. The vacuum catches it all. I could see exactly what I was doing, and there was no cleanup at the end of the day. It would be impossible to do a proper fairing job with a standard flat power plane. There are both concave and convex shapes that need to be all planed in. To accomplish the task, I had to modify the power planes. Two of the planes I ground a curve in the blade. This would address the concave areas of the boat. On one of the planes, I shimmed the back of the sole. This way, the back of the sole and the front of the skill plane would hit before the blade. By adjusting the depth, I would take down just the highs in the flat areas. To shape the convex parts of the boat, I glued a piece of formica onto the sole of the plane. Then with a grinder, I dished it out like the inside of a spoon. I then ground an inside curve into the knives. By carefully adjusting the foot, I could take off just the highs in whatever area of the boat that I was working. Because the power planes leave such a smooth cut, it was very easy for me to step back and see where the highs and lows were. This method of fairing worked out a lot better than I even imagined. After I had finished the planing, we went over the boat with longboards and 80 grit sandpaper. All that had to be done was taking out some mill marks and a few little ridges, and Chabasco was perfectly fair. I really wished I could have done this years ago, but it's only been recently that they came out with the small light power planes with the vacuum attachments. In all fairness, it was still a lot of work, but well worth it. We also overhauled the centerboard and rebuilt the centerboard winch. The rudder needed to be partially rebuilt. We expanded the prop aperture to make way for the new feathering prop and rebuilt the trailing edge. Then it was reinforced with a fiberglass and epoxy composite. Then Chabasco was repowered with a brand new engine.
Let's tweak.
Okay, hold.
You want me to go back up, please?
No, we're good. So what I want to do is take the chain hoist off.
The mast and rig were put back in my yard here in Wilmington. Chabasco went on to win first in class in the 2019 Transpac Regatta. Another restoration job well done.